Lightning split the sky like God's own judgment, illuminating the rotting bones of Jeremiah's barn in stark, terrible detail. Clara Evans collapsed against the splintered doorframe, her swollen belly contracting in waves of agony that made her vision blur white-hot at the edges. Rain hammered the roof in a relentless percussion that matched the thunder of her racing heart. She pressed her palm against the weathered wood, feeling splinters bite into her skin, and remembered the last time she'd stood in this place. It had been 3 months ago, when Mrs. Henderson had cornered her outside the general store in Dead Willow, her voice carrying that particular blend of righteousness and cruelty that frontier women wielded like a sharpened blade. Clara Evans. She'd hissed loud enough for half the street to hear. Walking around this God-fearing town with your belly swelling like some common whore. Shameless. Your poor dear mother would be spinning in her grave. The words had cut deeper than any physical blow, because Clara knew they carried the weight of the entire community's judgment. Dead Willow had been built on copper and gold, but it sustained itself on gossip and moral superiority. Now, as another contraction seized her body like iron bands tightening around her middle, Clara clawed at the earth beneath her hands and prayed to a God who seemed to have turned his face away from her completely. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether her pursuers found her or not, whether she lived through this night or not. Thunder rolled across the Badlands like distant artillery, and somewhere in that sound she heard the echo of hoofbeats that might have been real or might have been the terror that had been chasing her for days. The barn smelled of decay and abandonment of dreams left to rot under the merciless frontier sun. Old Jeremiah had built it with hopes of cattle and prosperity, but the land had beaten him down like it beat down most men who dared to challenge the wilderness. Now it served as Clara's final refuge, a crumbling sanctuary, where she would either bring life into the world or surrender to the darkness that seemed to be closing in from all sides. She stumbled deeper into the barn, her sodden skirts clinging to her legs like grasping hands. The pain came again stronger this time, forcing her to her knees on the straw-covered floor. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see the storm raging across the Badlands, turning the world into a churning cauldron of wind and rain and violence. It seemed fitting somehow that her child would be born into such chaos. Nothing about this pregnancy had been easy or gentle or kind. Dead Willow had made sure of that. The town that had once welcomed her as their schoolteacher had turned against her the moment her condition became visible, as if her unmarried state was a disease that might contaminate their own carefully constructed respectability. She'd lost her position, her boarding house room, and finally her place in the community altogether. But it wasn't until Silas Pratt had come calling with his cold eyes and colder demands that she truly understood the danger she was in. Another flash of lightning revealed a shadow moving past the barn's entrance, and Clara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She pressed herself deeper into the straw, one hand protectively covering her belly, the other clutching the small derringer she'd managed to steal from the general store before fleeing town. It held only 2 shots, and she wasn't even sure she had the courage to use them, but it was better than facing what was coming with nothing but prayers and desperation. The shadow paused at the doorway, and Clara held her breath until her lungs burned. Then a voice cut through the storm, deep and gravelly and unfamiliar. "Ma'am, you in there? I saw your tracks leading this way." The accent was different from the local drawl, carrying hints of education beneath the frontier roughness. "I'm not looking to harm you. Just heard someone might be in trouble." Clara pressed her lips together to keep from crying out as another contraction seized her. She couldn't trust anyone, not after what Silas had done, not after the way the entire town had turned against her. But as the pain reached its crescendo, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of her water breaking, she realized she might not have a choice. The baby was coming now, ready or not, safe or not, and she was going to need help, whether she wanted it or not. The storm raged on outside, masking any sound of approaching riders. But Clara could feel them out there in the darkness, like wolves circling a wounded deer. Silas Pratt wouldn't give up easily, not when family honor and a substantial inheritance were at stake. He'd made that clear enough when he'd cornered her in the alley behind the church, his hand heavy on her shoulder and his voice carrying promises of consequences she didn't want to imagine. But right now, as lightning illuminated the barn in stark skeletal detail, and the stranger's shadow filled the doorway, Clara Evans faced a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the innocent life she carried. Trust the unknown voice in the storm, or face whatever was coming alone in the darkness of a decaying barn where dreams went to die. The decision was made for her when the next contraction hit with such force that she couldn't hold back the scream that tore from her throat, echoing through the barn like a wounded animal's cry. The shadow in the doorway moved, and she heard boots squelching through mud as the stranger approached. Through pain-blurred vision, she saw a tall figure in a long coat hat, pulled low against the storm, moving with the careful deliberation of a man accustomed to violence, but trying to appear non-threatening. The stranger crouched down beside her, and in the next flash of lightning, Clara caught a glimpse of his face. Weather-beaten and scarred with eyes that held shadows, she recognized because she carried similar ones herself. "Easy there," he said softly, his voice gentle despite its roughness. "Name's Eli Ward. Looks like you're in a spot of trouble, and I happen to be in the business of helping folks who need it." Clara tried to speak to warn him about the danger that might be following her. But another wave of pain crashed over her, and all she could do was grip his outstretched hand with desperate strength. Through the haze of agony, she heard him murmuring reassurances, his voice steady and calm in the chaos of the storm. She didn't know who he was or why he'd chosen to help her. But right now, he was the only thing standing between her and the howling darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. Dead Willow had been built in 1847 by copper prospectors who struck it rich in the nearby mountains. But those glory days were long past. Now it survived on stubbornness and spite, a collection of weathered buildings and weather-beaten souls clinging to the edge of civilization, like barnacles on a sinking ship. The town's moral code was as rigid as the mountains that surrounded it, and Clara Evans had learned too late that stepping outside those boundaries meant exile from everything she'd ever known. She'd arrived in Dead Willow 5 years ago, fresh from her teacher's college in Denver, full of hope and determination to make a difference in the lives of frontier children. The town had welcomed her with cautious optimism, desperate for someone educated enough to run their one-room schoolhouse. For 4 years, she'd been the picture of propriety, teaching reading and arithmetic to minors' children, while boarding with the widow Morrison and attending church services with unfailing regularity. But love, as Clara had discovered, didn't respect social boundaries or moral codes. When Thomas Pratt had ridden into town with his easy smile and charming words, she'd fallen harder than a cottonwood in a windstorm. He was everything the frontier men weren't: educated, refined, with soft hands that had never known calluses, and a voice that could quote poetry as easily as it could sweet-talk a schoolteacher into believing in fairy tales. Thomas had courted her properly, at first bringing flowers picked from the mountainsides and books ordered special from Denver. He'd spoken of marriage and children and a future bright enough to blind her to the darker truths about his family. The Pratts owned half the copper claims in the region, and Thomas was heir to an empire built on the backs of desperate men and ruthless business practices. But Clara had been too much in love to see past the romance to the reality underneath. When she'd finally surrendered to his persistent courtship one warm evening behind the schoolhouse, she'd believed with all her heart that they would be married before any consequences could manifest. Thomas had promised her as much whispering vows of love and commitment as the stars wheeled overhead. But promises, Clara learned, were as fragile as spun glass when they came up against family expectations and financial considerations. Now, as Eli Ward helped her settle against a pile of old saddle blankets, Clara remembered the morning Thomas had come to her with tears in his eyes and cowardice in his heart. His father had arranged a marriage with a banker's daughter from California, a union that would expand the family's influence and secure their financial future. Clara's love, no matter how genuine, couldn't compete with social advancement and political connections. She'd kept the pregnancy secret as long as possible. But frontier towns had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. By the time her condition became obvious, Thomas was long gone to his arranged marriage, leaving Clara to face the consequences alone. The town's judgment had been swift and merciless, stripping away her position, her reputation, and finally, her place in the community altogether. But it was Thomas's older brother Silas who had delivered the final blow. Unlike his charming younger sibling, Silas Pratt was a man of cold calculation and ruthless pragmatism. He'd cornered Clara 3 days ago with an offer that wasn't really an offer at all: surrender the child to the Pratt family to be raised as legitimate heir to their empire, or face consequences that would make her current exile seem like a mercy. Clara had fled that very night, stealing supplies and slipping away from Dead Willow like a thief in the darkness. She'd known Silas would follow. The Pratts didn't accept defiance from anyone, especially not from a disgraced schoolteacher carrying what might be their blood. But she'd underestimated his determination and the reach of his influence. The baby had chosen this storm-lashed night to make its appearance, trapping her in a decaying barn while her pursuers closed in like wolves scenting blood. Through the pain that came in increasingly frequent waves, Clara watched Eli Ward move about the barn with quiet efficiency. He'd found an old lantern and coaxed it to life, filling the space with warm, flickering light that pushed back some of the darkness. His movements were sure and practiced, suggesting experience with crisis situations, and there was something about his calm competence that helped steady her racing heart. "Water's breaking proper now," he said matter-of-factly, checking the supplies he'd pulled from his saddlebags. "Baby's coming whether we're ready or not. You got a name picked out?" His tone was conversational, probably trying to distract her from the pain, but Clara appreciated the effort to treat this as something normal rather than the desperate situation it actually was. "Hope," she gasped between contractions. "If it's a girl." Margaret Hope. The name carried the weight of both aspiration and memory, hope for the future, and remembrance of her sister Margaret, who died in childbirth 3 years ago. Margaret had been everything Clara tried to be: strong, brave, uncompromising in her convictions. She would have fought for this child with her last breath. Eli nodded approvingly. "Hope's a good name for a frontier child. They'll need plenty of it." He paused in his preparations, head tilted, as if listening to something beyond the storm. "You expecting company tonight?" "Unfriendly company." Clara's blood chilled. "Why do you ask?" "Because I just heard horses and they're moving careful-like. The kind of careful that suggests folks who don't want to be heard." Eli's hand moved to the gun at his hip, a gesture so natural it seemed unconscious. "You want to tell me what kind of trouble you're running from?" Before Clara could answer, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats penetrated the storm's fury. They were distant, but approaching, moving with the deliberate pace of hunters who knew their prey was cornered. Clara felt the familiar terror that had been her constant companion for days, but now it was sharpened by the vulnerability of her condition and the presence of an innocent man who'd stumbled into danger by trying to help her. "The Pratt family." She said the words barely audible over the storm. "They want the baby. They think it gives them rights." She couldn't bring herself to explain the full complexity of the situation and the way Silas had twisted family honor and legal technicalities into a weapon aimed at her heart. Eli's expression darkened and something cold and dangerous flickered in his eyes. "The Pratts, you say? I've heard of them. Not much good from what I recall." He moved to the barn's entrance, peering out into the storm with the alertness of a man accustomed to violence. "How many men is he likely to bring?" "I don't know." Clara admitted, her voice thick with pain and fear. Silas has money. He can hire as many as he needs. Another contraction seized her stronger than before, and she couldn't hold back the cry that escaped her lips. The baby was coming fast, now driven by its own urgent timetable that paid no attention to the danger closing in around them. Eli returned to her side, his hands gentle but sure as he helped her shift position. "Listen to me," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I've been in worse spots than this, and I'm still breathing. We're going to get through this night, you and me and this baby. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say when the time comes." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. There was something about Eli Ward that inspired confidence, despite the dire circumstances. He moved like a man who'd faced death before and emerged victorious, and right now that was exactly what she needed. The storm raged on outside, but inside the flickering circle of lantern light, Clara felt a fragile bubble of safety forming around them. The hoofbeats grew closer, and through the spaces between the barn's weathered boards, Clara caught glimpses of torchlight dancing in the darkness. Silas had come just as she'd known he would, and he'd brought help. The question now was whether Eli Ward was skilled enough, fast enough, and determined enough to stand against whatever force the eldest Pratt son had assembled. As if summoned by her thoughts, Silas Pratt's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "Clara Evans." He called, his tone carrying the arrogant certainty of a man accustomed to having his demands met. "I know you're in there, girl. Come out and we'll discuss this like civilized people. No need for anyone to get hurt." Eli's hand tightened on his gun, and he shot Clara a look that was both reassuring and grim. "Civilized people," he repeated quietly. "The kind who hunt pregnant women through storms. Real paragons of virtue." He raised his voice, pitching it to carry through the barn walls. "She's not going anywhere, Pratt. Find another way to spend your evening." The silence that followed was more ominous than any threat could have been. Clara felt the weight of eyes watching the barn, calculating angles and possibilities. Silas Pratt was many things, but he wasn't a fool. He would probe for weaknesses, test their defenses, and when he found his opportunity, he would strike with all the ruthless efficiency that had built his family's empire. Another contraction gripped Clara, and this time she felt the unmistakable pressure that meant the baby was coming, now ready or not. She reached for Eli's hand, her fingers white-knuckled with strain. "It's time," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "The baby's coming." Eli nodded grimly, caught between two impossible demands. Outside, armed men waited for their moment to strike. Inside, new life demanded its chance to enter the world. The storm raged on, indifferent to human struggles, while lightning illuminated the barn in stark, dramatic flashes that made everything seem like scenes from a fever dream. Clara closed her eyes and gripped Eli's hand tighter, drawing strength from his steady presence. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not only her fate and her child's, but possibly the fate of the decent man who'd chosen to stand between them and the darkness. In the flickering lantern light of a decaying barn, surrounded by enemies and battered by storms, she prepared to bring hope into a world that seemed determined to crush it before it could draw its first breath. The pain came in waves, now relentless, and building towards something that felt like the end of the world. But between the contractions and the brief moments of clarity, Clara found herself thinking not of the danger outside, but of the possibility that somehow, against all odds this night, might end with something beautiful rather than something tragic. Hope she'd decided to name her daughter, and hope was what she chose to cling to as the storm reached its crescendo and the future balanced on the edge of a knife. Silas Pratt's voice came again, closer now, and tinged with the kind of cold anger that made Clara's blood run cold. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Clara. The child belongs with family. We can provide things you never could: education, position, a future worth having. Don't condemn your bastard to a life of poverty and shame out of misguided pride. The words hit Clara like physical blows, but they also sparked something fierce and protective in her chest. This child, her child, would never be a bastard, no matter what society might say. Love didn't require marriage certificates, and family wasn't always about blood. She'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but she'd learned it thoroughly. Well, go to hell, Pratt. Eli called back his voice, carrying a hint of amusement that seemed wildly inappropriate given their circumstances. The ladies made her position clear. Time for you to respect it and ride on home. A gunshot split the night, the bullet splintering wood inches from Eli's head. Clara screamed, but whether from pain or terror she couldn't say. The contractions were coming faster now, each one stronger than the last, and she could feel her body preparing for the final push that would bring her daughter into this violent, dangerous world. That was a warning. Silas called out his voice, carrying the cold satisfaction of a predator who knew his prey was cornered. The next one won't be. You've got 1 minute to send Clara out, stranger. After that, we're coming in, and anyone who gets in our way will regret it. Eli checked his rifle, his movements quick and efficient. How many men you figure he's got out there? He asked Clara, but she was beyond answering, caught in the grip of a contraction so powerful it seemed to split her in half. When it passed, she gasped for air and tried to focus on his question. At least 3, she managed. Maybe more. Silas doesn't take chances. She gripped his arm with desperate strength. You don't have to do this. You could leave, save yourself. I wouldn't blame you. Eli's smile was grim, but genuine. Ma'am, I've got 2 rules I live by. First, never abandon someone who needs help. Second, never let bullies have their way if you can prevent it. Silas Pratt seems to qualify on both counts. The minute Silas had given them stretched like an hour, filled with the sound of Clara's labored breathing and the steady drumming of rain on the barn's roof. Then, with shocking suddenness, the barn door exploded inward as 2 men with rifles burst through their faces, hard with purpose and greed. Eli's reaction was lightning quick, his rifle speaking twice in rapid succession. The first man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. The second dropped behind an old feeding trough, his return fire splintering wood and sending splinters flying through the air. Clara pressed herself as low as she could, one arm protectively covering her belly, while the other reached for the derringer hidden in her skirts. Jake Tommy. Silas's voice cracked like a whip from outside. What's happening in there? Bastards armed, one of the men Jake apparently called back. Professional by the look of it. We need more firepower. Eli had taken cover behind a broken stall, reloading with practiced speed. How you doing over there? He called to Clara, his voice calm despite the bullets flying around them. Baby's coming now. Clara gasped, feeling the overwhelming urge to push. I can't stop it. And then don't. Eli said grimly. Do what your body's telling you to do. I'll handle the company. He rose from cover and fired again, driving the remaining gunman deeper behind his improvised shelter. The barn had become a battleground, filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of fear. But beneath the violence and chaos, life persisted in its own urgent rhythm. Clara felt her daughter crowning the sensation, so overwhelming it pushed everything else, the danger, the fear, even the pain, into the background. Nothing mattered now except bringing this child safely into the world, regardless of the circumstances surrounding her birth. Another gunshot echoed through the barn, followed by a cry of pain that wasn't Clara's. She looked up to see Eli clutching his left arm, blood seeping between his fingers. But his right hand still held his rifle steady, and his eyes never left the hiding place of their remaining attacker. I'm fine, he said before she could ask, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. Just a graze. How close are we to meeting this baby? Close. Clara panted, bearing down with all her strength. Very close. The next contraction brought her daughter's head fully into view, and Clara sobbed with a mixture of relief and terror. So close now, so very close to holding her child in her arms. Outside the barn, she could hear Silas organizing his men for another assault. There were definitely more than 3 of them. She counted at least 5 different voices, maybe 6. The odds were becoming impossible, but Eli Ward seemed determined to hold his ground, regardless of the cost. The baby's shoulders emerged with the next push, and suddenly, everything accelerated. Clara felt her daughter slip free in a rush of fluid and relief so intense it left her gasping. The barn filled with a new sound, the strong, healthy cry of a newborn, taking her first breath in a world that had tried its best to prevent her arrival. Well, I'll be damned. Eli breathed, his voice filled with wonder, despite their dire circumstances. She's beautiful, Clara. Absolutely beautiful. Clara reached for her daughter with trembling hands, pulling the tiny, perfect form against her chest. Hope was red and wrinkled and covered in birth fluids, but she was alive and breathing and miraculously whole. For one perfect moment, nothing else mattered, not the men outside, not the danger they were in, not the uncertain future that lay ahead. There was only this, her daughter in her arms, safe and sound, and absolutely perfect. Then reality crashed back as Silas Pratt's voice cut through the storm, closer now, and filled with cold determination. Enough games. We're coming in ready or not. That child belongs to the Pratt family, and I'll kill anyone who stands in my way of claiming what's mine. Eli moved to the barn's entrance, his wounded arm forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Clara, he said without turning around. There's a loose board in the back wall. If things go bad, you take that baby and run. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run and keep running until you're somewhere safe. What about you? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Eli Ward had appointed himself their protector, and he would hold that line until his last breath if necessary. I'll buy you as much time as I can, he said simply. That little girl deserves a chance to grow up free, and I aim to see she gets it. The sound of approaching footsteps squelched through the mud outside, and Clara clutched her daughter closer. Hope had stopped crying and was looking up at her with dark, serious eyes that seemed far too wise for a child only minutes old. In those eyes, Clara saw something that gave her strength, not just hope, but determination. This child would survive. She would grow up free and strong and unashamed of her origins. Whatever it took, Clara would make sure of that. Lightning illuminated the barn in stark detail, revealing Eli Ward standing guard at the entrance, like some frontier angel of vengeance rifle, ready and jaw set with grim purpose. Outside, Silas Pratt and his hired guns prepared for their final assault, confident that numbers and firepower would carry the day. But they had underestimated 2 crucial factors: the desperate love of a mother for her child, and the stubborn honor of a man who refused to let bullies have their way. The storm reached its crescendo as if nature itself was preparing for the violence to come. In the warm circle of lantern light, Clara Evans cradled her newborn daughter and prepared to fight for the right to call her family complete. The night was far from over, and the real battle was just beginning. The attack came at dawn, just as the storm was beginning to weaken, but while darkness still provided cover for approaching enemies. Clara had dozed fitfully through the remaining hours of night, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Eli maintained his vigilant watch at the barn's entrance. The respite had been temporary. Both of them knew Silas wouldn't give up so easily. The first sign of trouble was the smell of smoke drifting through the barn's weathered walls. Clara's eyes snapped open, instantly alert, and she saw Eli's silhouette tense against the gray light filtering through the doorway. "They're trying to smoke us out," he said grimly, checking his ammunition. "Silas is done playing games." Clara struggled to her feet, still weak from childbirth, but driven by maternal instinct stronger than pain or exhaustion. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see orange flames licking at the dry brush surrounding the barn. The fire was small now, but it would spread quickly in this wind, and soon their shelter would become a death trap. "The back wall," she said, remembering Eli's earlier words. "You said there was a loose board." Eli nodded toward the rear of the barn. "Third board from the corner bottom row. It'll take some working, but you can squeeze through if you have to." He paused, listening to something only he could hear. "They're moving. At least 4 men, probably more. They'll rush us when the smoke gets thick enough." Clara made her way to the back wall. Hope cradled carefully in one arm while she tested the board Eli had indicated. It was loose, held in place by only a few rusted nails, but it would take precious time to work it free. Time they might not have. The smoke was getting thicker now, seeping through every crack and crevice in the barn structure. Clara could hear the fire crackling as it spread, fed by years of accumulated dead grass and debris. Soon the barn itself would catch, and then their choice would be simple surrender to Silas or burn alive. "Clara." Eli called softly, his voice carrying an odd note she couldn't identify. "There's something I need to tell you. About why I'm here, why I found you tonight." She looked up from her work on the loose board, struck by the serious tone of his voice. "What do you mean?" Eli was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the approaching flames. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old guilt and carefully buried pain. "I wasn't just passing through when I heard you crying. I was looking for someone. A woman named Rebecca Ward." Clara's blood turned cold. "Rebecca was my sister's married name. She died 3 years ago." "I know," Eli said quietly. "She was my sister too. My twin sister, to be exact. And she died because I wasn't there when she needed me most." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Rebecca had married a man named Jonathan Ward and moved to a homestead near the Colorado border. She'd died in childbirth during a blizzard when no doctor could reach her, leaving behind a grieving husband and a daughter who'd lived only 3 days. Clara had received the news in a letter months after the fact, and the guilt of not being there for her sister had haunted her ever since. "Jonathan wrote to me." Eli continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Told me how Rebecca called for me at the end, how she wanted her twin brother there to hold her hand while she—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I was off chasing glory in the war, too proud and too stupid to come home when my family needed me." Clara stared at him, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You came looking for me because of Rebecca. Because you couldn't save her. When I heard about a pregnant woman in trouble near Dead Willow, about the Pratt family hunting her—" Eli shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying years of regret and determination. "Maybe I can't undo what happened to Rebecca, but I can damn well make sure history doesn't repeat itself." The smoke was getting thicker, and Clara could hear voices outside, growing more urgent. Silas's men were preparing for their final assault, confident that the fire would drive their quarry into the open, where they could be easily captured. But Clara felt something shift inside her, a new understanding of the forces that had brought her and Eli together on this storm-lashed night. "Rebecca used to say there were no coincidences," she said, working frantically at the loose board. "She believed everything happened for a reason, even when we couldn't see it at the time." "Maybe she was right," Eli replied, but his attention was focused on the barn's entrance, where shadows were beginning to move in the smoke-hazed dawn light. "Get that board loose, Clara. It's time to go." The board came free with a grinding squeal of rusted nails, leaving a gap just wide enough for Clara to squeeze through if she was careful. She could see open ground beyond, and past that the dark line of trees that marked the beginning of true wilderness. If she could reach the forest, she might be able to lose herself in hope in the maze of valleys and canyons that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. "Go," Eli urged, but Clara hesitated at the opening. "Come with us." she said, knowing even as she spoke that he wouldn't leave his post. Eli's smile was sad but genuine. Someone needs to keep them busy while you get away. Besides, I've got 3 years of guilt to work off. This seems like a good place to start. Before Clara could argue, the barn's front entrance exploded in a hail of gunfire. Silas's men had made their move, charging through the smoke with rifles blazing. Eli's response was immediate and devastating. His rifles spoke rapidly, each shot carefully aimed and deadly accurate. Clara heard curses and cries of pain from the attackers, but there were too many of them, and they kept coming despite their losses. "Go!" Eli shouted over the gunfire. Now, while they're focused on me, Clara squeezed through the gap in the wall, hope clutched protectively against her chest. The baby had remained remarkably calm throughout the chaos, as if she somehow understood that survival depended on silence. Clara emerged into the gray morning light and immediately began running toward the tree line. Her legs shaky from childbirth, but driven by desperation and maternal instinct. Behind her, the gunfight continued to rage. She could hear Eli's rifle answering the attackers shot for shot, and she knew he was buying her precious time with his own blood. The thought of leaving him behind was agony. But she also knew that Hope's survival depended on reaching safety before Silas could organize pursuit. She was halfway to the trees when she heard a voice that made her blood freeze in her veins. There she is. The woman and the baby, they're running for the forest. Clara risked a glance over her shoulder and saw 2 of Silas's men breaking away from the main fight, running hard in her direction. They were both younger and stronger than she was, and they weren't weakened by recent childbirth. Simple mathematics told her they would catch her long before she reached the safety of the trees. But sometimes mathematics didn't account for the fierce desperation of a mother protecting her child. Clara clutched Hope tighter and forced her exhausted legs to move faster, driven by a strength she didn't know she possessed. The trees seemed impossibly far away, but she focused on them with single-minded determination, refusing to acknowledge the pursuing footsteps that grew steadily closer. A gunshot cracked behind her, and Clara felt the bullet whistle past her ear. They were close enough to shoot accurately now, and she realized with growing horror that they weren't trying to kill her. They were hurting her, driving her away from the trees and toward a rocky outcropping where she would be trapped with nowhere to run. The realization came too late. Clara found herself pressed against a sheer rock face, breathing hard and clutching Hope with desperate strength. Her pursuers approached slowly now, confident in their victory, their rifles trained on her with casual precision. "Easy there, miss." The taller of the 2 men said, his voice carrying mock gentleness. "No need to make this harder than it has to be. Mr. Pratt just wants to talk to you about the child's future. Nothing unreasonable about that." Clara pressed her back against the cold stone and felt for the derringer hidden in her skirts. 2 shots against 2 men. If she was lucky and accurate, she might be able to fight her way clear. But even if she succeeded, there were more men back at the barn, and Silas himself was still unaccounted for. The child's future is with her mother. Clara said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Not with a family that considers her property to be claimed. The second man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Property's exactly what she is, miss. Blood calls to blood, and Pratt blood don't belong with some disgraced schoolteacher living hand-to-mouth in the wilderness. Clara's fingers closed around the derringer's grip, and she began to slowly work it free from the folds of her skirt. The men were overconfident, standing too close together and paying more attention to their own clever words than to her movements. She would have 1 chance, maybe 2 if she was very lucky, and then it would be over one way or another. But before she could draw the weapon, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made all 3 of them freeze. Someone was coming fast, riding hard across the open ground between the burning barn and the rocky outcropping. Clara's heart sank as she recognized the rider's silhouette. Silas Pratt himself, mounted on a magnificent black stallion and radiating the cold fury of a man whose plans had been frustrated. Silas reined his horse to a stop and dismounted with fluid grace, his expensive clothes somehow unmarked by the night's violence. He was a handsome man in a cold, aristocratic way, with steel-gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that gave him an air of distinguished authority. But Clara had seen the cruelty that lurked beneath his polished exterior, and she knew that his arrival meant the end of any hope for mercy or compromise. "Miss Evans," Silas said formally, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. "You've led us quite a chase. I trust the child arrived safely despite the rather primitive circumstances." Clara lifted her chin defiantly. "My daughter is perfectly healthy, no thanks to you and your hired guns." "Your daughter?" Silas repeated, savoring the words like fine wine. An interesting choice of words, considering that the child carries Pratt blood in her veins. Blood that comes with certain obligations. "Thomas abandoned us both." Clara said, her voice sharp with old pain. "He made his choice when he married that banker's daughter in California. He has no claim on hope, and neither do you." Silas's smile was as cold as mountain snow. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear. You see, Thomas's marriage was arranged by the family for financial reasons, but it was never consummated. The bride in question had certain preferences that made traditional marriage impossible. The union was annulled quietly 6 months ago, though we've allowed the fiction to continue for business purposes." Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. If Thomas's marriage had been annulled, if he was still legally free to marry. "That doesn't change anything," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "And on the contrary, it changes everything." Silas continued smoothly. "Thomas is prepared to do the honorable thing, marry you, legitimize the child, bring you both into the family fold where you belong. All you have to do is stop this foolish running and accept the generous offer I'm making." The offer hung in the air between them like a serpent, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Clara could see the trap hidden within Silas's words. Marriage to Thomas would indeed legitimize hope, but it would also place both of them completely under Pratt family control. She would become a decorative wife, useful only for producing heirs, while hope would be raised according to Silas's wishes rather than her own. "And if I refuse?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Silas's expression hardened. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to take more direct action to protect the family's interests. The child is a Pratt, Miss Evans, and she will be raised as one, whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you'll be part of her life, or—" He let the threat hang unfinished, but its meaning was crystal clear. Clara's hand tightened on the hidden derringer, and she felt hope stir in her arms, as if sensing the tension in the air. 2 shots against 3 men, and even if she succeeded, there would be more where these came from. Silas Pratt had the money and influence to hunt her to the ends of the earth if necessary, and she was just one woman alone in a wilderness that showed no mercy to the weak or defenseless. But as she looked down at her daughter's perfect face, Clara felt something fierce and uncompromising crystallize in her chest. Hope deserved better than a life of gilded captivity, better than being raised as a trophy for Silas's ambitions. Whatever the cost, Clara would ensure her daughter grew up free to make her own choices and forge her own destiny. "I have a counteroffer." Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "Go to hell." Silas's face darkened with genuine anger, and for the first time, Clara saw cracks in his polished facade. "You're making a serious mistake, Miss Evans. I'm trying to be reasonable here, but my patience has limits." "So does mine," Clara replied, and drew the derringer in one smooth motion. The 2 hired guns reacted with professional speed, but Clara had the advantage of surprise and desperation. Her first shot took the taller man in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Her second shot went wide as the surviving gunman tackled her, but the bullet passed close enough to Silas's head to send him diving for cover behind his horse. Clara went down hard, her arms instinctively curling around Hope to protect her from the impact. The remaining gunman's hands closed around her throat, and she felt his strength beginning to overpower her own. Darkness crept in around the edges of her vision, and she knew that in moments it would all be over. Then a rifle cracked from somewhere behind them, and the gunman's grip went slack as he pitched forward with a bullet between his shoulder blades. Clara gasped for air and rolled away, clutching Hope protectively as she looked around for the source of their salvation. Eli Ward stood silhouetted against the burning barn, his rifle still smoking in his hands. He was wounded. Clara could see blood staining his shirt in several places, but he was upright and deadly as a striking rattlesnake. Behind him, the barn was fully engulfed in flames, sending a pillar of black smoke into the dawn sky, like a funeral pyre for Silas's ambitions. "Sorry I'm late." Eli called out his voice, carrying across the distance between them. "Had to take care of some business first." Silas emerged from behind his horse, his expensive clothes disheveled and his composure finally cracking. "This isn't over, Ward." He shouted, his voice thick with rage and frustration. "You can't protect them forever. I have resources you can't imagine." Eli's response was to lever another round into his rifle's chamber. "Maybe not forever," he agreed. "But I can protect them long enough for you to get tired of bleeding money on a lost cause. How many men you willing to lose over one baby Pratt? How much is your pride worth in actual dollars?" For a moment, Clara thought Silas might order another attack despite the odds. But then she saw something change in his expression, a cold calculation replacing the hot anger. He was a businessman first and foremost, and even family honor had to be weighed against the bottom line. The cost of pursuing Clara and Hope was growing higher by the hour, and the potential return on investment was becoming questionable. "This isn't over," Silas repeated, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Blood calls to blood, Miss Evans. That child will know where she comes from eventually, and when she does, she'll come looking for her real family." Clara struggled to her feet, Hope still safe in her arms. "She'll know exactly where she comes from," she said firmly. "She'll know she comes from love, not obligation, from choice, not coercion. And she'll know that her real family is the one that wanted her for herself, not as a piece of property to be claimed." Silas mounted his horse with sharp, angry movements. "We'll see about that," he said, but the fight had gone out of him. "We'll just see about that." He wheeled his horse around and rode hard toward the horizon, leaving behind the bodies of his hired guns and the smoldering ruins of his carefully laid plans. Clara watched him go until he disappeared into the morning haze, and only then did she allow herself to believe that they might actually be safe. Eli approached slowly, favoring his left leg and moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd pushed his body past its limits. "How's the little one?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the exhaustion that lined his face. "She's perfect," Clara said, and meant it. Hope had slept through most of the violence, as if she somehow understood that safety lay in silence and stillness. "How badly are you hurt?" "I'll live," Eli replied, though Clara could see the cost of the night's fighting written in every line of his body. "Question is, what do we do now?" Silas meant what he said. This isn't over. He'll be back with more men, more money, more determination. Clara looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and felt something settle into place inside her chest, something solid and unshakable as mountain bedrock. "Then we'll be ready for him," she said simply. "Hope and I aren't running anymore. We're going to find a place to call home, and we're going to defend it." Eli studied her face for a long moment, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "In that case," he said, "I reckon you're going to need some help. Good thing I happen to be between jobs at the moment." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you tie yourself to our troubles? You've already done more than anyone could ask." Eli's smile was tired, but genuine. "Because Rebecca would have wanted me to," he said. "And because some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are stacked against you. Maybe especially then." As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, Clara Evans stood beside Eli Ward and looked out over the vast expanse of frontier wilderness that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Somewhere out there was a place they could call home, a place where hope could grow up free and strong and unafraid. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worth having ever was, but for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope for the future. Behind them, the barn burned down to its foundation, consuming the last remnants of their desperate night. Ahead lay uncertainty and challenge, but also possibility and promise. Clara adjusted her grip on her daughter and took her first step toward whatever came next, confident that she wouldn't be walking that path alone. The morning sun painted the wilderness in shades of gold and amber, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song of welcome to the new day. Clara Evans listened to that song and smiled, knowing that she and Hope were finally truly free to write their own story in whatever way they chose. The future was wide open and waiting, and they were going to meet it head-on with courage, determination, and the unshakable bond of family. Not the family they'd been born into, but the one they'd chosen to create together. 6 months later, Clara stood in the doorway of a small but sturdy cabin, nestled in a valley 20 miles north of Dead Willow, watching Hope take her first tentative steps across the rough-hewn wooden floor. The baby had grown into a healthy, curious child, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wonder of the frontier itself. Eli had kept his word about helping them find a place to call home. He'd also proven surprisingly adept at the practical aspects of building a life from scratch, constructing the cabin with his own hands, teaching Clara to hunt and fish and preserve meat for the long winter months, and generally serving as the steady, dependable anchor that their small family needed. The location had been carefully chosen for defensibility as much as comfort. The valley was accessible by only 2 narrow passes, both of which could be easily watched and defended if necessary. A clear stream provided fresh water year-round, and the surrounding forest was rich with game and wild plants that could supplement their carefully tended garden. More importantly, they were far enough from civilization to avoid the prying eyes and wagging tongues of people like Mrs. Henderson, but close enough to the settlement of Pine Ridge to trade for supplies and maintain contact with the outside world. It was, Clara reflected, exactly the kind of place she would have chosen if she'd been free to choose from the beginning. The threat from Silas Pratt hadn't materialized as expected. There had been a few incidents in the early months, mysterious riders watching their valley from the ridgeline, supplies going missing from their cache, small acts of harassment designed to make them feel unsafe and unwelcome. But Eli's military experience had served them well in dealing with such tactics, and eventually even those minor annoyances had ceased. Clara suspected that Silas had found other priorities to occupy his attention. The copper market had taken a downturn, and several of the Pratt family's major investors had pulled out of their ventures. Fighting a war of attrition against 2 determined settlers in a remote valley was expensive, and Silas was nothing if not practical when it came to matters of business. But the real surprise had come 3 weeks ago in the form of an unexpected visitor. Clara had been hanging laundry when she'd spotted a lone rider approaching through the eastern pass, moving slowly and deliberately, as if unsure of his welcome. When the man had drawn close enough for her to see his face clearly, her heart had nearly stopped. Thomas Pratt sat his horse like a man who'd aged 10 years in the space of 6 months. His face was thinner than she remembered, marked with new lines of stress and uncertainty, and his expensive clothes had been replaced with the practical garb of a working rancher. But his eyes, those were the same warm brown eyes that had first captivated her in Dead Willow's schoolhouse so many months ago. "Hello, Clara," he'd said quietly, his voice carrying none of the easy confidence she remembered. "I was hoping we could talk." Eli had emerged from the cabin at the first sound of approaching hoofbeats, his rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. The two men had sized each other up with the wary respect of natural enemies forced into temporary proximity, and Clara had found herself caught between past love and present loyalty in a way that made her chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Say your piece and ride on," Eli had said bluntly. "We've got nothing to discuss with anyone named Pratt." But Thomas had surprised them both by dismounting and removing his hat in a gesture of genuine humility. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he'd said, addressing his words to Clara while keeping a careful eye on Eli's rifle. "I know I failed you when you needed me most, but I'm here to try to make things right if you'll let me." The conversation that followed had been painful and awkward and necessary in equal measure. Thomas had confirmed what Silas had told them: his marriage had indeed been annulled, though not for the reasons his brother had claimed. The banker's daughter had simply decided that frontier life wasn't for her and had returned to San Francisco with a substantial settlement to ensure her silence about the family's business practices. More importantly, Thomas had broken with his family completely over their treatment of Clara and Hope. The final confrontation had come when he'd learned about the night attack on the barn, and the revelation that Silas had been willing to use deadly force to claim a child had disgusted him beyond reconciliation. "I know I can't undo what I did." Thomas had said, his eyes fixed on Clara's face with desperate intensity. "I know I chose security over love, family expectations, over doing what was right. But I'm here now, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to make amends." Clara had listened to his words with a mixture of old pain and new understanding. The man standing before her was different from the charming young heir who'd swept her off her feet in Dead Willow. This Thomas carried the weight of consequence and regret, the hard-won knowledge that some choices could never be undone, no matter how much one might wish otherwise. "What exactly are you proposing?" she'd asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Marriage," Thomas had said simply. "A real marriage this time, based on honesty rather than pretty lies. I want to be a father to Hope if you'll let me. I want to give both of you the security and protection of the Pratt name, without the control that usually comes with it." Eli had made a sound of disgust, but Clara had held up a hand to forestall his objections. This was her choice to make, and she needed to make it with full knowledge of what was at stake. "And your brother?" she'd asked. "How do we know this isn't just another attempt to gain control over Hope?" Thomas's expression had hardened with something that looked like genuine anger. "Silas and I are no longer on speaking terms. I've withdrawn my share of the family assets and started my own operation. If he wants to cause trouble for you, he'll have to go through me first." The offer had hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning a chasm of hurt and mistrust. Clara could see the logic in it. Marriage to Thomas would indeed provide security and legitimacy for Hope. And this older, humbler version of the man she'd once loved seemed genuinely committed to making amends for his past failures. But logic wasn't the only consideration. Over the past 6 months, Clara had built something precious and irreplaceable with Eli and Hope. They were a family forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose, bound together by choice rather than obligation. The thought of disrupting that delicate balance for the sake of social convention and legal protection felt like betrayal of the worst kind. "I need time to think," Clara had said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." Thomas had nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. I'll be staying at the hotel in Pine Ridge for the next week. If you decide you're willing to give me another chance, you know where to find me." He'd ridden away without another word, leaving Clara and Eli to stare after him in uncomfortable silence. The easy peace of their valley had been shattered by possibilities and complications they'd thought were safely buried in the past. That night, after Hope had been settled in her crib, Clara and Eli had sat by the fire and talked until dawn about choices and consequences and the different kinds of love that shaped a person's life. It had been the most honest conversation Clara had ever had with anyone, stripping away pretense and social expectation to reveal the raw truth underneath. "He's right about one thing," Eli had said eventually, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Marriage to him would give you and Hope legal protection I can't provide. The Pratt name carries weight in this territory, and there are doors it could open that will always be closed to a man like me." Clara had turned to study his profile in the firelight, seeing the pain he was trying so hard to hide. "Is that what you think this is about, social advancement and legal technicalities? Isn't it?" Eli had replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "You deserve better than a life of hiding in the wilderness with a broken-down ex-soldier who can't offer you anything but trouble and uncertainty." Clara had reached out to take his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life in their texture. "You're right," she'd said quietly. "I do deserve better. I deserve a man who was there when I needed him most. I deserve someone who chose to stand between me and danger without counting the cost. I deserve a family built on love and mutual respect rather than obligation and social convenience." Eli had looked at her, then his eyes reflecting the firelight like windows into a soul that had been wounded but never broken. "Clara, I love you." She'd said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Not because you saved us, not because you've been kind to Hope, but because you're the man I choose to build a life with. If that's not enough reason to turn down Thomas's offer, then I don't know what is." The kiss that followed had sealed a promise deeper than any spoken vow, and when Thomas had returned the next week for his answer, Clara had given it to him with quiet finality. She was grateful for his offer and his apparent change of heart, but her choice had already been made in a barn during a thunderstorm when a stranger had chosen to stand between her and the darkness. Thomas had taken the rejection better than expected, perhaps, recognizing something in Clara's expression that made further argument pointless. He'd asked only to be allowed to acknowledge Hope as his daughter, legally ensuring she would have a claim to Pratt inheritance if she ever chose to pursue it. Clara had agreed to that much, understanding that it was both a gift to Hope and a form of protection against any future claims Silas might try to make. Now, watching her daughter take those first precious steps across their cabin floor, Clara felt a deep sense of satisfaction with the choices that had brought them to this moment. Hope would grow up knowing exactly who she was and where she came from. But more importantly, she would grow up free to decide who she wanted to become. Eli emerged from the barn where he'd been tending to their small herd of cattle, his face brightening as he saw Hope's unsteady progress across the room. "Well, look at that," he said, sweeping the baby up into his arms. "Someone's going to be running around getting into trouble before we know it." Hope giggled and patted his cheek with one small hand, her face glowing with the kind of uncomplicated joy that only children could manage. To her, Eli wasn't a replacement father or a convenient protector. He was simply Papa, the man who'd been there for every important moment of her short life. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she watched them together, struck by the realization that sometimes the most beautiful things in life came from the most unexpected places. She'd set out to be a schoolteacher in a frontier town and had ended up a mother and pioneer in a hidden valley. She'd fallen in love with a charming heir and had found her soulmate in a scarred veteran with shadows in his past. None of it had gone according to plan, but all of it had led her exactly where she needed to be. A sound from outside caught Eli's attention, and he moved to the window with the instinctive alertness that never completely left him. Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety even after 6 months of peace. The memory of that night in the barn remained vivid enough to make her nervous about unexpected visitors. But Eli's posture relaxed as he identified the approaching figure. "It's Sarah from Pine Ridge," he said, referring to the postmistress who occasionally made the journey to their valley with mail and news from the outside world. Looks like she's got something for us? Sarah Mitchell was a widow in her 50s who'd taken over the Pine Ridge post office after her husband's death from pneumonia 2 winters ago. She was a practical, no-nonsense woman who'd quickly become one of their few connections to the civilized world, carrying letters and messages when the monthly mail delivery proved too infrequent for their needs. Our morning Clara Eli. Sarah called out as she dismounted from her sturdy mare. Hope you don't mind the unscheduled visit, but I've got a letter here that seemed too important to wait for regular delivery. Clara accepted the envelope with curious concern, noting the expensive paper and the unfamiliar return address from Denver. The handwriting was feminine and educated, written with the kind of careful penmanship that suggested formal schooling and social refinement. Any idea who it's from? Sarah asked, her curiosity clearly piqued by the quality of the stationery. Clara broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the contents with growing amazement. It's from Elizabeth Pratt, she said slowly. Thomas and Silas's sister-in-law. She says... Clara paused, rereading the letter to make sure she'd understood correctly. She says she's been trying to find us for months. Eli moved closer, his expression wary. What does she want? Clara continued reading, her voice growing stronger as the letter's purpose became clear. She's offering financial support. Not from the family, from her own personal inheritance. She says she was horrified when she learned about Silas's actions, and she wants to help make amends. The letter went on to explain that Elizabeth had married into the Pratt family 5 years ago, bringing with her a substantial inheritance from her late father's shipping business. She'd never felt comfortable with Silas's heavy-handed methods or his treatment of people he considered beneath his notice. But she'd lacked the courage to speak out until she'd learned about his pursuit of Clara and Hope. She's enclosed a bank draft. Clara said, her voice faint with disbelief. For $5,000. She says it's the least she can do to help ensure Hope has opportunities the Pratt name would have provided. Sarah whistled low under her breath. $5,000, that's enough to buy half of Pine Ridge. Eli's expression remained skeptical. Seems awfully convenient. How do we know this isn't another scheme from Silas? Maybe he's using his sister-in-law to get close to you when direct approaches failed. But Clara was studying the letter more carefully, noting details that suggested authenticity. She mentions things only someone genuinely sympathetic would know, like the fact that I was a schoolteacher and that I lost my position because of the pregnancy. She also says she's included documentation proving the money comes from her personal accounts, not from Pratt family assets. Indeed, a second sheet of paper contained what appeared to be legitimate bank documentation showing the transfer of funds from Elizabeth Pratt's personal account to a trust established in Hope's name. The paperwork looked official and detailed enough to be convincing, though Clara knew she'd need to have it verified by someone with legal expertise. Now there's more. Clara continued, turning to the final page of the letter. She says she's filed formal complaints against Silas with the territorial authorities about his use of violence to settle family disputes. Apparently, attacking a woman in childbirth crossed a line even for frontier justice standards. Sarah nodded approvingly. About time someone held that family accountable for their actions. The Pratts have been acting like they own this entire territory for too long. Eli remained unconvinced. It could still be a trap. Maybe Elizabeth is genuine, but that doesn't mean Silas won't try to use her generosity to his advantage somehow. Clara folded the letter carefully, her mind racing with possibilities and implications. $5,000 would indeed change everything for their small family. It would allow them to expand their homestead, perhaps buy more livestock, or even start a small business in Pine Ridge. More importantly, it would provide security for Hope's future money, for education, for medical care, for all the things a child needed to thrive in the modern world. But Eli's caution was well-founded. The Pratt family had already demonstrated their willingness to use any means necessary to get what they wanted, and generosity could be just another form of manipulation if wielded skillfully enough. "What does your gut tell you?" Clara asked Eli, trusting his instincts in matters of danger and deception. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the valley's rim. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "My gut says this Elizabeth woman is probably genuine. The documentation looks real, and the timing makes sense given what Thomas told us about the family's internal conflicts. But my gut also says we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Money like that comes with strings attached, whether we can see them or not." Sarah cleared her throat diplomatically. "Well, I hate to interrupt this family discussion, but I've got 3 more stops to make before sundown. You want me to carry any messages back to Pine Ridge?" Clara considered for a moment, then nodded. "Tell the bank manager we'll be coming in to discuss some financial matters, and ask him to recommend a lawyer who specializes in inheritance and trust law. We're going to need professional advice before we make any decisions about this money." After Sarah had departed, Clara and Eli spent the rest of the day discussing the implications of Elizabeth's unexpected offer. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening, covering everything from practical considerations about money management to deeper questions about accepting help from people connected to their former enemies. Hope seemed to sense the importance of the adult discussion, remaining unusually quiet and attentive throughout the meal. She was becoming more aware of the world around her every day, and Clara sometimes caught glimpses of intelligence in her daughter's eyes that suggested she understood far more than her limited vocabulary could express. As night fell and they prepared for bed, Clara found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken over the past year. She'd started as a disgraced schoolteacher, fleeing through a thunderstorm with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her womb. Now she was potentially a woman of independent means, with a loving family and a secure home in one of the most beautiful valleys she'd ever seen. The transformation seemed almost too dramatic to be real, but Clara had learned that the frontier had a way of compressing lifetimes of change into the space of a few short months. People rose and fell with breathtaking speed out here, and survival often depended more on adaptability than on careful planning. "Whatever we decide about the money," Eli said as they settled into their shared bed, "we make the decision together. This family operates on consensus, not on one person deciding what's best for everyone else." Clara reached for his hand in the darkness, intertwining their fingers with a kind of intimate familiarity that came from months of shared challenges and mutual support. "I love you for saying that," she whispered. "But I also know you well enough to know you'll try to convince me to take the money, even if you have reservations about it, because you think it's what's best for Hope." Eli's chuckle was soft and rueful. "Am I that transparent?" "Only to someone who's learned to read you like a favorite book," Clara replied. "But you're right about Hope deserving every advantage we can give her. The question is whether those advantages are worth the potential complications that might come with them." They talked quietly for another hour, weighing options and exploring possibilities, until exhaustion finally claimed them both. Clara's last conscious thought was of Hope, sleeping peacefully in her crib, blissfully unaware that her future might be about to change in ways that would shape the rest of her life. The next morning brought a new visitor to their valley, but this time it was someone they recognized and welcomed. Thomas Pratt rode up to their cabin with the easy confidence of a man who'd been invited rather than one who was intruding, and Clara realized that their conversation about Elizabeth's letter had prepared her to see him in a different light. "I heard Sarah Mitchell was out this way yesterday," Thomas said by way of greeting. "She mentioned you'd received an important letter. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of hidden knowledge or ulterior motives, but Thomas seemed genuinely concerned rather than calculating. "Your sister-in-law wrote to us," she said carefully. "She made a very generous offer." Thomas nodded, his expression unsurprised. "Elizabeth mentioned she was trying to track you down. She's been feeling guilty about the family's actions for months now." The money is legitimate by the way she inherited it from her father's shipping business, so there are no ties to Pratt family interests. Eli emerged from the cabin, hope balanced on his hip and his free hand resting casually on his gun belt. The gesture wasn't overtly threatening, but it served as a subtle reminder that protective instincts remain strong despite the apparent peaceful nature of the visit. "Thomas," Eli said with neutral politeness, "what brings you all the way out here?" "Partly curiosity about Elizabeth's letter," Thomas admitted. "But mostly I wanted to share some news that might affect your decision about accepting her offer." Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. "What kind of news?" Thomas dismounted and removed his hat, a gesture that had become his signal of serious intent. "Silas has been arrested by territorial marshals on charges of assault and attempted kidnapping. Elizabeth's formal complaint triggered an investigation, and several other people came forward with similar stories about his methods of settling business disputes." The news hit Clara like a physical blow, though whether from relief or shock, she couldn't say. "Arrested when?" "3 days ago. He's being held in Denver pending trial, and his lawyer says the evidence against him is substantial enough that conviction is almost certain. He's looking at several years in territorial prison, assuming he's not transferred to federal custody on more serious charges." Eli's expression remained skeptical. "Prison sentences can be shortened with enough money and influence. How do we know he won't be back in 6 months with a full pardon and a bigger grudge?" Thomas's smile was grim but satisfied. "Because the territorial governor is up for re-election next year, and he's made law and order his primary campaign issue. Pardoning someone convicted of attacking a woman in childbirth would be political suicide, no matter how much money the Pratt family might contribute to his campaign." Clara felt a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. For months, she'd lived with the constant awareness that Silas might return at any moment with renewed determination and better resources. The knowledge that he was facing genuine legal consequences for his actions felt almost too good to believe. "There's more," Thomas continued. "The investigation has uncovered evidence of other illegal activities, land fraud, mining claim, jumping intimidation of competitors. The territorial authorities are treating this as an opportunity to clean up some long-standing problems with business practices in this region." Hope chose that moment to reach for Clara, apparently deciding that her mother looked more interesting than the stranger who was dominating the adult conversation. Clara took her daughter gratefully, drawing comfort from the warm weight of the small body in her arms. "What does this mean for your family's business interests?" Clara asked, realizing that Silas's downfall would have far-reaching consequences beyond their immediate situation. Thomas shrugged, but Clara caught a hint of satisfaction in his expression. "The legitimate parts of the business will continue under different management. The questionable parts will be shut down or sold off to settle civil lawsuits. Overall, it's probably the best thing that could have happened to the Pratt family reputation in the long term." Eli shifted Hope to his other arm, his posture gradually relaxing as the implications of Thomas's news sank in. "So, you're saying the threat is essentially over? We don't need to keep looking over our shoulders anymore?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Thomas confirmed. "Silas no longer has the resources or the freedom to pursue personal vendettas. Elizabeth's offer of financial support is genuine and safe to accept if you choose to do so. And Hope can grow up without worrying about unwanted attention from her biological father's family." Clara felt tears begin to gather in her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. The constant, low-level fear that had become such a familiar part of her daily life was finally beginning to recede, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: genuine hope for the future. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, meaning it with all her heart, "for everything you've done to help resolve this situation. I know it couldn't have been easy to go against your own family." Thomas's smile was sad but genuine. Families should protect each other, not prey on each other. Silas forgot that lesson somewhere along the way, and it cost him everything that really mattered. He mounted his horse and prepared to leave, but paused to look down at Hope one more time. She's beautiful, Clara, and she's lucky to have parents who put her welfare above everything else. That's a gift not every child receives. After Thomas had ridden away, Clara and Eli stood in comfortable silence, watching their daughter explore the fascinating texture of Eli's shirt buttons with intense concentration. The valley around them seemed more peaceful than ever, as if nature itself was responding to the removal of the threat that had hung over them for so long. "So," Eli said eventually, "what do you think about Elizabeth's offer now?" Clara considered the question seriously, weighing all the factors that had changed with Thomas's news. "I think we should accept it," she said finally. "Not because we need it to feel safe, but because Hope deserves every opportunity we can give her. And because Elizabeth is trying to make amends for her family's actions in the only way she knows how." Eli nodded approvingly. "I agree. But we do it on our terms with proper legal documentation and clear understanding of what we're accepting. No hidden strings, no future obligations beyond what we choose to take on ourselves." "Agreed," Clara said. "And we use part of the money to establish a trust fund for Hope's education, part to improve our homestead, and part to help other families who might find themselves in situations similar to what we faced." The conversation about how to use Elizabeth's generous gift continued throughout the day and into the evening. But it was a different kind of discussion than they'd had before. Instead of focusing on potential dangers and hidden agendas, they were able to talk about positive possibilities and hopeful plans for the future. As night fell and they prepared for bed, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she'd been a disgraced schoolteacher, fleeing through a thunderstorm with nothing but desperation and determination. Now she was a woman with a loving family, a secure home, and the financial resources to build whatever kind of future she could imagine. But more importantly, she was free. Free from the judgments and expectations of people like Mrs. Henderson. Free from the threats and manipulations of people like Silas Pratt. Free to raise her daughter according to her own values and principles without interference or coercion from anyone. That freedom, Clara realized, was worth more than any amount of money Elizabeth Pratt might offer. It was the real treasure she'd found in this hidden valley, and it was something no one could ever take away from her or Hope, as long as they had the courage to defend it. 1 year later, Clara stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching Hope chase butterflies through the wildflower meadow that had become their daughter's favorite playground. The child was walking confidently now, her chubby legs carrying her on adventures that seemed to cover more ground every day. The cabin had grown along with their family, thanks to Eli's skill with carpentry, and the financial resources Elizabeth's gift had provided. They now had separate bedrooms, a proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove, and even a small study where Clara had begun tutoring children from Pine Ridge and the surrounding homesteads. The return to teaching had been Elizabeth's suggestion, included in one of the regular letters she'd begun sending after her initial financial gift. She'd pointed out that educated teachers were scarce in the frontier territories, and that Clara's experience and qualifications were too valuable to waste on purely domestic pursuits. Clara had been hesitant at first, worried about leaving Hope in others' care, and concerned about reopening old wounds related to her loss of position in Dead Willow. But Eli had encouraged her to pursue the opportunity, and the response from local families had been overwhelmingly positive. Now, 3 days a week, their valley rang with the voices of children learning to read and write and cipher. Clara had discovered that she loved teaching even more than she'd remembered, and the extra income from tuition payments had allowed them to achieve a level of financial independence that seemed almost luxurious by frontier standards. The trust fund for Hope's education had grown steadily invested in carefully chosen business ventures that promised steady returns over the long term. By the time their daughter was ready for advanced schooling, there would be enough money to send her anywhere in the country or even abroad if her interests led in that direction. But the most satisfying use of Elizabeth's gift had been the establishment of a fund to help other women in desperate circumstances. Working with Sarah Mitchell and several other women from Pine Ridge, Clara had created a network of safe houses and resources for women fleeing abusive situations or facing abandonment and destitution. The fund had already helped a dozen families establish new lives in safety and dignity. And word was spreading through the frontier grapevine that there were people willing to help when traditional sources of support failed. Clara took particular pride in the fact that no one who asked for help was turned away, regardless of their circumstances or the social judgments they might be facing. Eli had thrown himself into the work with enthusiasm, using his military experience to help establish secure transportation routes and safe meeting places. He'd also begun training some of the women in basic self-defense techniques, recognizing that confidence and practical skills were often as important as financial assistance in helping people build new lives. Their marriage had been formalized 6 months ago in a simple ceremony performed by the traveling minister, who served the scattered communities of their region. It had been a small gathering, just the three of them, Sarah Mitchell as witness, and a few of their closest neighbors from Pine Ridge. But the simplicity of the ceremony had suited them perfectly. Their commitment to each other had been forged in crisis and tested by adversity long before any official vows were spoken. The legal recognition was just a formality, a way of ensuring that their family would be protected by law as well as by love. Hope had been the star of the wedding, toddling confidently between her parents during the ceremony and charming everyone present with her bright smile and fearless curiosity. She was growing into a child who seemed to embody the best qualities of both her parents, Clara's intelligence and determination, combined with Eli's steady courage and practical competence. More importantly, Hope was growing up free from the shadows that had haunted her early life. She knew nothing of the violence and danger that had surrounded her birth, and with Silas safely imprisoned and the immediate threats resolved, there was no reason she ever needed to learn about those dark early days. Thomas had become a regular visitor to their valley, stopping by monthly to share news from the outside world and to maintain his connection to Hope. He'd proven to be a surprisingly thoughtful and undemanding presence in their lives, content to be an occasional uncle figure rather than pushing for any more significant role. His own life had stabilized considerably after his break with the family business. He'd established a successful horse breeding operation on land he'd purchased with his personal savings, and there were rumors that he was courting a widow from Denver who shared his interest in responsible business practices and social reform. Elizabeth had visited once, making the long journey from Denver to see Hope and to assess the impact of her financial assistance. She'd proven to be a warm, intelligent woman, genuinely committed to making amends for her family's past actions. Her visit had strengthened the bonds of friendship that had developed through their correspondence, and she'd left with an invitation to return whenever her travels brought her to their region. Even Dead Willow had undergone changes in the past year. The discovery of significant silver deposits in the nearby mountains had brought new prosperity to the town, along with a more diverse population that was gradually diluting the rigid moral certainties that had once dominated local culture. Mrs. Henderson still held court among the town's self-appointed moral guardians, but her influence had waned considerably as newer residents proved less susceptible to her particular brand of righteous judgment. Clara occasionally received news from her former home through Sarah Mitchell's postal connections, but she felt no desire to revisit the place that had treated her so harshly during her time of greatest need. The present and future were far more interesting than the past, and Clara had learned to focus her energy on building rather than remembering. Their valley had become a refuge, not just for their own family, but for anyone seeking a fresh start and a chance to prove their worth through honest effort rather than social connections. As she watched Hope discover a particularly fascinating butterfly, Clara reflected on the lessons she'd learned during their dramatic journey from desperation to security. The most important lesson was that family wasn't just about blood relationships or legal formalities. It was about people who chose to stand by each other through good times and bad, who put love and loyalty above personal convenience or social expectations. The second lesson was that strength came not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them with courage and determination. The night in the barn had been the worst experience of Clara's life, but it had also been the moment when she discovered reservoirs of strength and resilience she'd never known she possessed. The third lesson was that hope, real hope, not just wishful thinking, was one of the most powerful forces in the world. It had sustained her through months of uncertainty and danger, and it continued to guide her decisions about how to build a future worthy of her daughter's potential. Hope chose that moment to toddle back toward the cabin, her small hands filled with wildflowers she'd picked for her mother. Clara knelt to receive the gift, breathing in the sweet fragrance of mountain blooms and the even sweeter scent of her daughter's hair. "Beautiful flowers, sweetheart," Clara said, gathering Hope into her arms. "Just like the beautiful girl who picked them." Hope giggled and patted Clara's cheek with one flower-sticky hand, her dark eyes sparkling with the kind of uncomplicated joy that made every struggle worthwhile. This was what Clara had fought for during that terrible night. Not just survival, but the right for her daughter to grow up surrounded by love and acceptance and unlimited possibility. Eli emerged from the barn where he'd been tending their small herd of cattle, his face lighting up as he saw his two favorite people sharing their daily flower ritual. He'd become completely devoted to Hope, treating her with the kind of patient, attentive love that suggested she'd been his daughter from birth rather than a child he'd acquired through marriage. "How are my girls doing this evening?" he asked, settling down on the cabin's front steps and reaching out to tickle Hope's feet. "We're perfect," Clara replied, and meant it with all her heart. Absolutely, completely perfect. As the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and deep purple, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns that had brought them to this moment. The path hadn't been easy, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. Hope fell asleep in Clara's arms as they sat together on the steps, her small body warm and relaxed, with the kind of complete trust that children could only give to parents who'd proven themselves worthy of it. Clara listened to her daughter's soft breathing and to the evening sounds of their valley cattle lowing in the distance, night birds calling from the forest, and the gentle whisper of wind through the meadow grass. It was the sound of peace, Clara realized. Real peace earned through struggle and sacrifice, and the kind of love that refused to accept defeat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight was perfect just as it was. She looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and silently thanked Rebecca, whose memory had brought Eli to them when they needed him most. She thanked Elizabeth, whose generosity had provided security and opportunity beyond anything Clara could have imagined. She even thanked Thomas, whose weakness had paradoxically created the circumstances that led to something far stronger and more genuine than their original relationship could ever have become. But mostly she thanked the frontier itself, harsh and unforgiving as it was, for teaching her that strength came from within, that family was what you made it, and that hope was always worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. In the warm circle of Eli's arm, and with Hope sleeping peacefully against her chest, Clara Evans Ward finally understood what home really meant. It wasn't a place or a building or even a piece of land. It was the feeling of being exactly where you belonged, with exactly the people who mattered most, ready to face whatever the future might bring with confidence and love and unshakable determination. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow reassuring in their eternal constancy. Clara closed her eyes, listened to the sound of her family breathing, and knew with absolute certainty that this was the beginning of something beautiful rather than the end of something difficult. Tomorrow, Hope would wake up ready for new adventures and discoveries. Tomorrow, Clara would teach eager children to read and write and dream. Tomorrow, Eli would continue building the life they'd all chosen together. But tonight, in the perfect stillness of their hidden valley, they were simply a family complete content and finally truly free.